Well, it's unusual. It seemed unusual to me. I found that the snow had the quality of, it's almost got the quality of ice cream. It's heavy, but at the same time, it's still maintaining its structure. It's unusual. When it first began to fall, uh, it was like bugaboo powder. It was really, really fine powder snow blowing around on the ground like smoke, as I remember it from my days in the Arctic. And and then it changed. It sort of slumped, and then it took a new texture to it. But it's an unusual quality of snow. It's sticky and heavy, and it's got a sheet of ice underneath it. It'll be gone by Friday probably, but it's fascinating. I came to Victoria 76 years ago, and I was brought here by my parents. I had no say in it. I've thought about that quite a bit. We came to Victoria on the first train to come down the Fraser Valley after the Great Flood of 1948. We were the first train through. I should back up a little bit and say my parents came here for an interesting reason. I was born on January the 1st, 1947. It was the coldest night of the coldest year of the decade. And the war was over. I was born in a hospital in Lancashire that still had, my mother tells me, I can't remember of course, but my mother told me that there were still burn patients from the Air Force in the hospital recovering from their wounds from 1945. 2 years later, they were still undergoing treatment. And the hospital that I was born in was where they invented the waterbed, precisely because they dealt with burn patients. So the night that I was born, my father was not allowed to come into the hospital, so he was sent away. I was born sometime around midnight, or just shortly after midnight. And the nurse took me away. And initially my mother thought they're giving me a rest, but then I didn't come back, and I didn't come back, and she wondered about it. Finally, the nurse brought me back, and my mother said they had a little blanket for me, and my feet were hanging out the bottom of the blanket, little baby feet, and they were blue from the cold. No central heating, right? And so my mother remonstrated with the nurse, and the nurse said, "Oh, I'm so sorry about that, but he's the first baby to be born in this hospital since the war started, because it was dealing with all these military patients. And so the men insisted that I take him around the wards so they could see the baby. So I took him around, and she said every time I brought him to a bed, they wanted to hold his feet. So they'd reach up and hold my feet. And the next day, my mother woke up, and there was a big box of apples. All right, this was right after the war. Rationing is still in place and whatnot. There were these big, beautiful red apples. And the men in the wards had pooled all their rations and put all the apples together and sent her a box of apples, which was a really big deal. So later, when I was, a year old or so, my parents have decided they're going to leave England. They wanted to go to Canada or South Africa or somewhere. And the first feeling my father had was he wanted to go to South Africa because one of his uncles was there and had been there since right after the Boer War, right after the First World War, I guess. And so he thought, I've got relatives there, maybe I'll go, maybe we'll go there. And my mother put her foot down. She said, no, I don't want to go there. I want to go where the apples came from. Where'd the apples come from? They came from this place called the Okanagan Valley in Canada. So that's where we're going to go. She'd been in the Women's Land Army during the war, and she had a real sense of horticulture and agriculture and whatnot. She wanted to go any place that produced apples like that. That's where she wanted to go, and that's why we wound up here. That's how I came to be here. I've been away. I went away to work for quite a while, and then came back. My wife is from the Saanich Peninsula. She grew up on Arbutus Cove, and she was the real impetus to come back here. This is really where she's from. I've lived many, many places. After we came to Victoria, my father was an itinerant journalist, and he moved around a lot. We lived in Nanaimo, we lived in Cedar, we lived in Port Alberni, we lived in the Okanagan, we lived in Alberta, right? We lived all kinds of different places. My wife was from here. Her family's been here since the 1860s, I think. And she wanted to come back. And who was I to argue with that? She dragged around with me to all these other places, so that's why we're back here. But I do feel a real sense of place here. I do feel at home here. I guess it's because I spent part of my time growing up here as a very small child. I was here before the Pat Bay Highway was built. I like to point that out. I had the privilege over my life of visiting almost every nook and cranny in British Columbia. I've been everywhere, from the Mizziadine in the north to the desert in the south, from the top pass in the Rocky Mountains to the furthest point west. This is a little magic bubble. Climatically, geologically, it's different from the rest of the province. Not just the east coast of the island, but up the Fraser Valley as well. But if you think of Vancouver, Greater Victoria, Nanaimo, that is a little magical bubble of climate. We sit here and, concern ourselves about a day of snow and some sub-zero temperatures. The rest of the province experiences that every year for months, right? And we are, in a way, cut off from that experience to some degree, because so many people, as I came to learn, never leave the Lower Mainland. Right? They've got this province out there, which is the size of Western Europe. British Columbia is the size of Western Europe. You could take Germany, France, and Spain and put them in British Columbia. There are about a dozen geoclimatic zones. So it's not only the size of Western Europe, it's more diverse than Western Europe. 40 of the rarest species in Canada live in British Columbia. This is their native place. So the place is so amazing, and yet nobody goes to it. They get on planes and go to Hawaii, right? They take holidays in Palm Springs. They go to Mexico. Like, I've never understood why anybody would want to go anywhere when you can just get in your car and drive for 4 hours and be in a totally different landscape with people who have different experiences and different histories. There are 40 different First Nations on the Fraser River alone. There's this huge diversity of cultural differences and language differences and oral histories that are different, literary differences. So when I think about Simon Fraser coming into this landscape as alone, he was basically with 8 other guys, and they come 800 miles down the Fraser River, and each First Nation passes them on to the next First Nation, not without trepidation in some cases. He has a passage in his journals about arriving off what's now Lillooet, and nobody's there. And then suddenly, out of the landscape, this whole group of warriors just appears. They've been invisible, and then they're not invisible. And he has to negotiate a peaceful passage with them, and successfully does. And so for me, the Fraser journey is a metaphor, not for the traditional trope of Europeans discover because he didn't discover anything. He was going over terrain that had already been widely traveled, and he was being guided by people who lived there, and they were serving as interpreters for him. But he understood that, and he acknowledges all of that in his journal. But he makes this long journey all the way to the coast and back without firing a shot in anger, without having a conflict with anybody, until his last visit with the Musqueam people at the Greasy Grass. And the reason that occurred was that there was a war going on between the Musqueams and the Cowichan at the time, and they didn't know who he was. But when the Musqueams came out and menaced him, they brought their canoes out. He instructed his men to fend them off with their paddles, not to shoot. All his men had muskets. They could have, wreak carnage on the Musqueam warriors who came out to challenge them. But he didn't do that. Instead, they fled back up the river till they got to friendlier territory. There are all kinds of stories about about how he stole a canoe, which he almost certainly did take a canoe without the permission of a chief, or coerced a chief I think it was from the Kwantle's. But nevertheless, he made it down the river to the sea and back up to Fort St. James without losing a person in his expedition and without harming anybody in any of the communities that he went through. And he gave us a record which in some ways is very admiring, right? When he talks about seeing the big houses, he talks about how the architecture of them is phenomenal, and the ability of people to build these houses as good as anything that he'd seen in Eastern Canada. This is not somebody who felt sort of superior. Now look, Simon Fraser was a man of his time, right? He was there to make money and to exploit the fur trade as much as he could. But he also understood that he needed the fur trade. Like, if he didn't have those people providing him with his raw materials, he was out of business, right? So it was very much a quid pro quo. And what people tend to do when they look back on that time is they look back with a kind of retroactive view of the power structure. They look to the past and they try and impose the power imbalance that exists today upon that time. It was the opposite then. There were maybe 30 white people in British Columbia when Simon Fraser set up his forts in the north. And maybe, we don't know how many, 100,000, 400,000, a million, we don't know for sure how many people there were. But the disproportionate numbers meant that he was at this huge disadvantage, living at the sufferance of the people who were there. They could have wiped him out at any time. Why didn't they? Because there was a valuable quid pro quo going on, a valuable exchange of commerce. So they didn't need him, but he had things they desired. He needed them if he was going to survive, and they had things he desired, and so there was this exchange. The imbalances that came to pass later had little to do with those original fur traders. They had almost everything to do with the influx of people looking for gold, right? People after that hard, glittering currency, and willing to do anything to anybody to get it, including their fellows, right? So not just First Nations, but each other. So this is when you start having these conflicts on the Fraser River between what you can call a white population, if you like, and the indigenous population over access to gravel on the gravel bars for gold panning, conflict between the white miners and Chinese miners, right? This is where the conflict comes from. Money is the root of all evil, right? The climate's milder here. It's a heck of a lot better to be out on a winter night in Victoria than it is in Edmonton or Winnipeg. So you have that. You also have the fact that it's the end of the line. You can't go any further. So people who just have this wanderlust and want to go and go and go and go, they get to the coast of British Columbia and there's no further to go, right? Well, I suppose you could go further if you had the resources and whatnot, but for somebody who's just drifting along, this is where people come up. So it's interesting to me that that then Tsimshian and the Nishiga have a word for white people, kumsiwa, driftwood.